Welcome, dear listeners, to another captivating mystery. I truly value your support, so if you're new here, please subscribe and hit that bell icon to never miss a good story. And now, let us begin. Murder on the Fairway. Chapter 1T, The Body on the 7th. That morning, the quiet of Brockenhurst Royal Golf Club was disturbed not by the familiar thwack of a well-struck ball, but by the muffled excitement of voices drifting on the breeze. At the gate, a constable waited to receive Inspector Harold Price of Scotland Yard. The man saluted smartly, his boots leaving dark prints in the dewy gravel. "Over there, sir, 7th hole. They're keeping the ground clear." Price nodded and walked briskly past the manicured hedges, his footsteps muted against the close, cropped grass. Beyond the pristine lawns and the gleaming windows of the clubhouse, the landscape opened wide, a quilt of rolling fairways edged with dark stands of beech and pine. On the rise where the 7th green lay, a flag rippled faintly. The scene before him was not one of gentlemanly leisure, but of somber stillness. A small knot of onlookers stood at a distance. 2 members in tweed jackets leaned on their brass-headed clubs, whispering nervously. At the center, a body lay face down on the short grass, limbs awkwardly splayed, a checked cap a few feet away. Price crouched beside the figure. Sir Lionel Dayne, senior diplomat, recently returned from Paris, was unmistakable even in death, his graying hair, the heavy line of his jaw, the broad shoulders filling the golfing jacket. He was well known to many in government and beyond. His face, now waxy, showed a faint discoloration around the lips. "Found him as he is, sir," reported Constable Wilkes, standing nearby. "Collapsed sudden, like while taking his stroke. Dr. Merrick says heart." He trailed off uncertainly. Price leaned closer, inhaling. A trace of something sharp pricked at his senses. Not grass, not the earthy smell of morning soil, but something else, a bitter chemical. He filed it silently in his mind. A boy stood apart from the group, nervously twisting a flat cap in his hands. Price beckoned him forward. "Your name?" "Percy Vale, sir. Caddy to Sir Lionel. I was with him the whole round." Percy nodded quickly. From the first tee, he was steady enough at the start, though quiet. Played 5 good holes. At the 7th fairway, he stopped to mark the card, licked the pencil. "Always did, sir," then gasped, clutched his throat, and went down. The boy's voice cracked on the last words. Price rose, brushing grass from his knee. He examined the items beside the body. A battered, mashy club resting where it had fallen, the scorecard, and a short pencil stub whose brass ferrule glinted in the light. Price lifted it with a gloved hand, noting the faint sheen upon the wood. Dr. Merrick arrived at last, red-faced and officious. He bent over Lionel, pressing fingers to the neck, peering briefly at the eyes. "Monsieur," he announced, unmistakable. "These diplomats lead hard lives, Inspector." One cannot be surprised. Price's gaze remained on the doctor, but he said nothing of the bitter scent. "Even so, doctor, I'll want the body removed discreetly to the library. Best to keep matters contained until I've spoken with the Foreign Office." Major Alistair Fenton, the club's captain, cleared his throat. "You'll understand, Inspector, we must consider the club's reputation. A sudden death on the course, particularly a man of Sir Lionel's stature, will bring unwelcome attention." "Indeed," Price said, his voice calm, all the more reason to be precise. He ordered the body carried on a stretcher to the stately clubhouse, its red brick facade gleaming in the sun. As they lifted Sir Lionel, Price's eye caught a faint irregular line on the scorecard, a wavering figure half, written at the 7th hole. The earlier scores were neat, tidy, almost elegant. Only here did the pencil falter. The caddy hesitated. Sir Lionel hadn't touched his flask today, he said quietly. gesturing to a small leather bottle found in the diplomat's pocket. He said he preferred plain water. Price slipped the flask into an envelope. He glanced once more at the pencil stub, now sealed in his evidence pouch, and then at the seventh flag fluttering gently against the sky. Whatever had happened on this fairway, it was no simple seizure. A man of influence lay dead in the grass, and Inspector Price of Scotland Yard intended to discover why. Chapter 20: Players and Alibis. The oak-paneled library of Brockenhurst Royal Golf Club was hushed, its high windows letting in a pale shaft of afternoon light. Sir Lionel's body had been carried to a side chamber, under the inspector's order, leaving the library as the scene of questioning. A long polished table stretched the length of the room, and around it 4 figures sat uneasily. Inspector Price stood at the hearth, his back to the fire grate, hands clasped lightly behind him. He looked not at the grand collection of leather-bound volumes nor at the hunting prints along the walls, but at the men before him. One of them, he knew, was the last to hear Sir Lionel speak. Perhaps one of them had reason to see him silenced. The club captain, Major Alistair Fenton, remained upright in his chair like a man on parade. Arthur Cortland, broad-shouldered and ruddy-faced, drummed nervous fingers against the table until his wife, seated a little apart, stilled his hand with a look. Opposite sat Gideon Hart, the American, whose silver hair and lively smile did little to conceal his unease. At the far end, Owen Pritchard, the young club professional, kept his gaze lowered to the grain of the wood, as though the polished surface might yield him comfort. Miss Phoebe Littleton, the efficient club secretary, moved quietly about the room, laying out a tray of tea and biscuits, a pen and notebook tucked against her arm. She knew every member's habits, their preferred tea times, their smallest indiscretions. Price watched her with interest, as much as the others. He began with Cortland. "You played as Lionel's partner this morning?" "Yes, Inspector," Cortland replied, his voice rough. "We were paired against Hart and Pritchard. Sir Lionel was in good form. He seemed cheerful, though a little distracted at times. At the 7th, he paused, marked the card, and, well, you know the rest. You usually keep score yourself, do you not?" Cortland shifted uneasily. "I do. Yes. I take pride in keeping the numbers neat. But this morning, Owen," he gestured toward Pritchard, suggested that Sir Lionel mark them. "Some matter about handicaps. Nothing of consequence." Price's gaze moved to the young professional. Pritchard colored faintly. "It was I who raised it, Inspector. Sir Lionel had played matches abroad, and there was a question about his handicap. I thought it better if his own figures were on the card. No more than that." Hart spoke up, his American accent a sharp contrast in the somber room. "I didn't see anything strange myself, Inspector. Sir Lionel seemed fine when we teed off. Talked a little about business in Paris. I thought it was just a normal game until Heath." He spread his hands helplessly. "Did he drink or eat anything while you played?" Hart shook his head. "Not that I saw." Miss Littleton, standing nearby, interjected. "I handed Sir Lionel a fresh scorecard myself this morning, Inspector, and a bundle of new pencils. They are kept sharpened in my desk. Nothing unusual." Price inclined his head. "And none of you noticed anything odd when he took the pencil?" Cortland frowned in thought. "He did what he always did, licked the point. I've told him often it was a habit he ought to break." The silence that followed was heavy. Price allowed it to stretch, watching faces shift. Major Fenton cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "We must remember, gentlemen, that this may have been no more than a seizure. Sir Lionel was not young." "Perhaps," said Price mildly. He drew the pencil stub from his pocket, sealed in its envelope. but I prefer to keep my conclusions for later." Dr. Merrick entered then, summoned from his brief examination. He repeated his view that the death resembled heart failure. Price merely thanked him and asked that he remain available. He did not mention the faint chemical scent he had noted. The inspector closed his notebook. "I shall need a full list of all present at the club between 9 and 10 o'clock. Every caddy, every guest, every member. Miss Littleton, I trust you can provide this." "Of course, Inspector," she replied promptly. He let his gaze sweep the room once more. The unease was palpable. Each person seemed to carry a private thought unspoken, a detail perhaps too small to share. But Price knew well that in such details lay the truth. "Until I say otherwise," he concluded, "no one is to leave the grounds of Brockenhurst. Sir Lionel Dayne was a man of the Crown Service. His death must be accounted for." A murmur of assent followed. As Miss Littleton collected the untouched cups, Price glanced again at Cortland. The industrialist's fingers twitched faintly, as if longing to pick up a pencil and mark neat columns once more. Filing the gesture away, Price knew that a man's habits could tell far more than his words. Chapter 30: Rumors Across the Rough. By early afternoon, the air at Brockenhurst Royal was thick with unease. Members who had come for a pleasant round of golf now huddled in subdued conversation, their eyes flicking toward the library windows as though they might glimpse the truth through glass. What had begun as a fine morning sport had turned with cruel suddenness into a story that would carry far beyond the hedges of the club. Inspector Price, notebook in hand, walked slowly along the terrace, appearing to take in the manicured lawns, but in truth studying the people. He knew that in moments of shock, tongues loosen rather than tighten. Rumor whispered between acquaintances often revealed more than direct questioning. Two elderly members were speaking just loudly enough to be overheard. "They say he had letters on him," one muttered. "From Paris." "Yes? Confidential. I shouldn't wonder. Poison, that's what I heard." "Cyanide. Nonsense. Fenton says the doctor put it down to heart failure. Better for the club that way." Price made no sign he had listened, but the fragment pleased him. The mention of poison had already seeped through the walls. Rumors, he thought, were like seeds scattered by the wind. Some would fall on barren ground, others take root. Mrs. Harriet Cortland sat apart under a striped awning, her posture impeccable, her parasol shielding as much as shade. She welcomed Price with a calm smile that seemed rehearsed. "Inspector, dreadful business, simply dreadful. Sir Lionel was admired by so many. I recall him at our summer FT. Charming, gracious. England will be poorer without him." "Indeed," said Price quietly. "You were not upon the course this morning." "No, I came rather later, intending to meet my husband. I remained here on the terrace until word reached us of the accident." Her composure was admirable, yet Price observed how tightly her gloved fingers pressed against the parasol handle. He left her with a courteous bow, storing away the detail. On the practice green, Owen Pritchard leaned against the railing, attempting nonchalance with a cigarette he had yet to light. His youth betrayed him. His voice wavered when he spoke. "It's shaken the place, Inspector. Sir Lionel seemed himself all morning, steady enough, apart from that cough. Only thing unusual was him keeping the score. Normally Cortland insists on it. I thought nothing of asking Sir Lionel today. Perhaps I shouldn't have. Why did you suggest it?" Pritchard shifted. "Some talk about his handicap abroad. I thought it tidier if his own hand marked the card. Proof against any future dispute. That's all." Price watched him silently until the young man flushed. A trivial explanation, perhaps true, perhaps not. It was Percy, the caddy, who proved most useful. The boy, still shaken, approached Price near the locker corridor, twisting his cap nervously. "Sir, there's something I didn't mention. This morning before the round, I saw Mrs. Cortland near the lockers. It was early, just after 8. Said she was looking for her husband's gloves. Thought nothing of it then, but with what's happened." "You are certain?" "Yes, sir. Plain as day." Price nodded. Children and servants, he knew, often observed what their betters overlooked. He dismissed Percy kindly and walked on. Miss Phoebe Littleton's office smelled of fresh cedar. At his request, she brought out the morning's box of pencils. Trimmed, sharpened, neatly aligned. All but one slot was filled. "I always remove one stub," she explained, faintly flustered. "I dislike an untidy box." Price bent to glance into her wastebasket, empty of pencil stubs. He did not remark on the omission. But Miss Littleton flushed as though he had. Later, as the sun dipped, a constable returned from his errand into town. His report was brief but telling. A chemist on the high street recalled a purchase made 2 weeks prior. A lady had asked for potassium cyanide, giving the explanation of treating moths in a trunk. She had signed the register. Cortland. The chemist had thought little of it. Price folded the notes into his book without a word. That evening the inspector walked alone down the course. The air had cooled. The fairways lay in lengthening shadow. At the 7th green, he paused, looking at the worn patch of grass where Sir Lionel had fallen. He pictured the game replayed, Sir Lionel marking the score, the pencil lifted to his lips, the sudden spasm, the collapse. A habit, simple, unconscious, had killed him. Yet that habit, Price thought, was not meant to be his downfall. It belonged to another. And if that was true, then Sir Lionel Dayne had died not by fate, but by mischance, caught in the snare of another's design. Chapter 4c, The Quiet Poison. The pathologist arrived from Southampton just after luncheon. A thin man with pale hands and an expression that betrayed nothing. Inspector Price stood by as the examination proceeded in the library's adjoining chamber. Sir Lionel's body stretched upon a table that usually bore maps of the course. After some minutes, the verdict came with quiet certainty. "There are signs not consistent with a seizure," the pathologist said, adjusting his spectacles. "The lips are thin, the lining of the stomach betrays irritation, and there is an odor." He paused delicately, but Price had already recognized it. "Cyanide," the inspector supplied. The doctor inclined his head. "Exactly. So." Price dismissed him and turned to the small collection of items. Retrieved from the scene the flask, the sandwiches, the water bottle, and, most damning, the pencil stub. Under a lens, tiny crystalline specks clung to the sharpened wood near the point. A few flecks glimmered faintly at the brass ferrule. A poisoned pencil, harmless to the eye, deadly to the touch of the lips. It was a chilling method, simple, precise, and, Price reflected, perfectly suited to a victim known for the thoughtless habit of wetting the pencil before making his neat figures. Except that Sir Lionel, by all accounts, never kept the score. Arthur Cortland did. As Price prepared his next round of questioning, he allowed himself to weigh the 4 principal figures once more. Arthur Cortland, the industrialist, had the very habit that made such a method effective. His sturdy presence and meticulous keeping of numbers betrayed a mind of order, not imagination. Yet men of order could provoke discontent in their wives, and discontent could breed desperate designs. Harriet Cortland, elegant and restless, was precisely the sort of woman who might find her husband's severity unbearable. The chemist's book, with its entry signed H. Cortland, lay like a shadow across her name. She was intelligent enough to know her husband's habits, shrewd enough to seize upon them, and daring enough to attempt a discreet purchase in town. Owen Pritchard, the ambitious young professional, had suggested Sir Lionel keep the card, a suggestion that changed the entire shape of the day. Was it a careless whim, or the deliberate steering of a poisoned pencil into another man's hand? His connection with Hart and his eagerness to rise beyond the confines of Brockenhurst made him a man who might take risks, though perhaps not with such subtlety. Gideon Hart, the genial American, seemed the least likely. His talk was all of money and golf, not politics. Yet foreigners with deep pockets and easy charm often concealed sharper purposes. His insistence on leaving for London struck Price as premature, perhaps even calculated. And then there was Miss Phoebe Littleton, quiet and precise, who sharpened every pencil with her own hands. She had nothing to gain, perhaps, but her little fluster over the missing stub lingered in Price's mind. In mysteries such as these, small details were rarely as innocent as they seemed. That evening, Price gathered the suspects once more in the library. The tall windows had turned dark, the lamplight falling upon their uneasy faces. On the table before him lay the pencil stub, now sealed in an envelope alongside the chemist's note. "Ladies and gentlemen," Price began, his voice steady, "the doctor has confirmed what I suspected on the green. Sir Lionel Dayne did not die of natural causes. He was poisoned, and the instrument was this pencil." He tapped the envelope lightly. Gasps met his words. Major Fenton muttered something about disgrace and reputation, while Gideon Hart gave a sharp whistle. Harriet Cortland's hand moved swiftly to her pearls, her eyes flashing toward her husband, before settling back on the inspector. "I will speak with each of you in turn," Price continued. "You will forgive me if my questions are blunt." He began with Arthur Cortland. "You, sir, usually kept the score, a small detail, but one noted by all. Tell me, do you often lick the pencil?" Cortland colored, his large hands knotting together. "A habit, Inspector." "A foolish one, I admit. I thought nothing of it." "Indeed, a habit well known to those close to you." Cortland's eyes flicked toward his wife. Perhaps next Price turned to Harriet Cortland. Her composure was admirable, but the inspector's tone was cool. "You were seen in the locker corridor early this morning before the round began. You gave as your reason a search for gloves. Yet later, at a chemist in town, a woman signing herself H. Cortland purchased potassium cyanide, supposedly for moths. Can you explain this, madam?" For a moment, Harriet's color drained, then returned swiftly. "My housekeeper manages such matters. If my name was used, it was without my knowledge. As for the locker corridor, I looked in vain for my husband's spare gloves. That is all." Price let the explanation stand without comment, but her fingers tightened upon the arm of her chair until her knuckles showed white. He turned his gaze upon Owen Pritchard. "You suggested Sir Lionel keep the score. Why?" Pritchard swallowed, his youthful bravado gone. "I thought it would settle any question of handicap. Nothing more, sir. A curious change on the very day the pencil was poisoned." "I swear I had no hand in it," the young man blurted, his voice too loud in the hushed room. Finally, Gideon Hart, the American, spread his hands in protest. "Inspector, I came here to play golf. Nothing else. I met Sir Lionel only last night at dinner. Why would I poison a man I barely knew? Strangers can profit from secrets, Mr. Hart. Sir Lionel returned from Paris with papers of importance. You dined with him. You golfed with him. And now he is dead." Hart's genial expression faltered for the first time. "You English see intrigue in every shadow. I assure you, my only interest here is in fairways, not diplomacy." Price studied them all, Cortland's defensiveness, Harriet's cool but strained denial, Pritchard's frightened protest, Hart's brash indignation. Each offered him pieces of a puzzle, But the picture, he knew, was not yet complete. He dismissed them for the night with a single warning. None of you are to leave Brockenhurst. Sir Lionel's death was no accident. Tomorrow I shall expect clearer answers, and I assure you I shall have them. As the suspects filed out, their footsteps echoing against the wood paneling, Price lingered alone by the dying fire. He touched the envelope containing the poisoned pencil. A woman's knowledge of a man's habit, a chemist's ledger, a nervous young professional, an American too eager to be gone. The threads were tightening, and Inspector Price meant to pull them all. Chapter 5: In a False Trail. The sun rose bright over Brockenhurst Royal, the fairways glistening with dew like threads of silver. Yet the usual cheer of golfers was absent. Clubs rested idle in their bags. Caddies lingered without work, and the entire clubhouse seemed subdued. The death of Sir Lionel Dayne had struck the heart of the club. His was no ordinary passing, and already whispers reached beyond the hedges into Hampshire society. Inspector Price, after a sleepless night, sat once more in the library, his coffee untouched beside him. On the polished table lay the envelope containing the poisoned pencil, the chemist's note, and the Foreign Office letter Major Fenton had handed him late the evening before. That letter, with its careful phrasing, noted him. It confirmed that Sir Lionel had been in Paris on trade discussions, but tucked in its last lines was the troublesome phrase, entrusted with preliminary drafts of an agreement. If those drafts were important, and the tone of the letter suggested they were, their absence from Sir Lionel's belongings was troubling indeed. Were they left in Paris, destroyed, or stolen here in England, perhaps even from the very course where he fell? Price turned the possibilities over in his mind. Poisoned by pencil was intimate, almost domestic, but missing drafts pointed outward to foreign hands. He knew well how governments love to cloak ordinary crimes in the shadow of espionage. Still, he had to pursue the thread, however faint. He began with Gideon Hart. The American entered with his usual confident stride, silver hair gleaming in the morning light. His tweed jacket was immaculate, his shoes polished. Yet Price thought the man looked more tired than the day before. "Inspector," Hart began, "I trust you've made progress. I have urgent business in London." "You'll remain here until I say otherwise," Price interrupted, his voice flat. He placed the Foreign Office letter on the table. Sir Lionel carried drafts of an agreement. They are not among his papers. Do you know what became of them? Hart's brows shot up. Drafts? I saw no papers. I came here to discuss a clubhouse, not trade agreements. Good Lord, Inspector, if you're suggesting I poisoned a man over tariffs. Stranger things have happened, Price said evenly. You dined with him the night before. He was distracted, you said. Distracted by what? Hart hesitated. He seemed thoughtful, that's all. He said he had a long morning ahead. He spoke of golf, whiskey, and... He stopped. And? Hart shifted. Nothing of consequence. Some remark about unfinished work. He didn't explain. Price leaned closer. And yet, when poison was mentioned yesterday, you wished to leave. Why so eager to run? Hart bristled. Because I dislike scandal. In my country, men settle matters quickly. Poison and intrigue. These are European games, Inspector, not mine. The protest rang too neatly. Price dismissed him with a warning, but Hart's confidence no longer seemed so secure. Next came Harriet Cortland. She glided into the room, still elegant despite a night of strain. Her pearls gleamed in the lamplight, though her eyes carried shadows. Madam, Price said quietly, yesterday I asked about the chemist's ledger. The entry was signed H. Cortland. Would you have me believe another placed your name there? Her chin lifted. That is precisely what I believe. My housekeeper may have signed on my behalf. I cannot speak to what she purchased. You were seen in the locker corridor early yesterday. Yes, I have said so already. Gloves. Must I repeat it endlessly? Sometimes repetition betrays the truth, Price replied. For the first time, she faltered. Her lips pressed thin, and a faint tremor touched her hands before she folded them in her lap. Inspector, I will endure your questions, but I will not endure your suspicion. My husband is stern, yes. Our marriage. It is not the tender thing it once was, but poison. Her voice lowered. That lies far beyond my imagination. Price studied her elegant, intelligent, restless. Her denial was calm, but her eyes betrayed something sharper, fear or calculation. Arthur Cortland entered next, his stride heavy, his jaw set. He refused to sit, looming instead at the head of the table like a man presiding over his own trial. You treat my wife harshly, Inspector, he said. This nonsense about chemists is insulting. Harriet may be many things, but she is no poisoner. Yet you admit she knows your every habit, including the way you lick a pencil before marking scores. Cortland stiffened. A foolish habit, I grant you, but hardly one to build such accusations upon. Harriet may be restless, but she would never stoop so low. If Sir Lionel was murdered, it was by foreign hands, not English ones. He spoke with a conviction born of pride rather than proof. Price heard in his voice a man desperate to protect his wife or his own honor. By noon, Price felt the weight of the false trail. Sir Lionel's missing drafts, Hart's bluster, the whispers of foreign hands. Yes, they added color, but they did not fit with the poisoned pencil. That method was too small, too careful, too dependent on one man's private habit. Espionage dealt in bribes and ambushes, not sharpened stubs of cedar. He walked the course in thought. The dew had burned off, and the fairways stretched green and bright under the sun. Yet the seventh hole drew him again, that patch of bruised grass where Sir Lionel had fallen. Price pictured the game, Cortland reaching for the card as he always did, only to have Pritchard suggest otherwise. Sir Lionel, distracted, marking the neat figures, licking the point as his friend would have, and dying, not by design, but by accident. Yes, this was not a spy's work. This was domestic, intimate, born of knowledge only a wife, or someone very close, would possess. Still, the drafts troubled him. Where had they gone? He resolved to ask Major Fenton to telegraph Paris at once. But in his heart, Price knew the foreign trail was smoke. The fire still smoldered near a home. That evening he would gather them all again, and this time he would tighten the noose. Chapter 60. The round played. The group assembled reluctantly at the first tee, their faces tight in the morning light. No one spoke as Inspector Price laid out the reconstruction. Mr. Cortland, Price said evenly, take your usual place. Arthur Cortland, stiff with pride, did as asked. He reached instinctively for the scorecard and pencil, his hand moving with the unconscious certainty of long habit. The moment his fingers closed around the stub, Price raised a hand. Stop. Arthur froze, the pencil poised just shy of his mouth, his ruddy face darkened with embarrassment. Price turned to the others. You see, the gesture is automatic. Mr. Cortland licks the pencil without a thought. It is a small quirk, one hardly worth remarking upon. Yet it was that quirk which invited murder. Only those close to him would know it well enough to exploit. Arthur shifted uncomfortably, his heavy jaw set, his eyes flashing toward his wife. Harriet stood nearby, immaculate in her pale linen dress, her parasol resting against her shoulder. If she felt the eyes upon her, she gave no sign. They moved together down the course, silent but for the crunch of their shoes on the gravel paths. When they reached the seventh tee, the fairway stretched out before them, shining in the sunlight. The spot where Sir Lionel had fallen was still visible, the grass pressed flat in a cruel outline. Price stopped there, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed green. Here, Sir Lionel marked the scorecard. Here he did what Mr. Cortland always did, licked the pencil before making his figures. He collapsed within moments. Gentlemen, ladies, the poison was not meant for Sir Lionel. It was meant for Arthur Cortland. Arthur reeled back as though struck. Harriet's eyes flickered, just for an instant, before she drew herself up with calm poise. "You dare," she said softly. "Yes, madam." "I do," Price replied. "You were seen near the lockers early that morning. You bought cyanide at a chemist's shop, signing the book H. Cortland. You knew your husband's habit. You counted on it. The only thing you could not foresee was that young Mr. Pritchard here would suggest Sir Lionel keep the card. A trivial change, but one that turned your plan awry." The group stood frozen. Pritchard swallowed hard, his face pale. Gideon Hart let out a low whistle, muttering something about damned English tragedies. Miss Littleton pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Major Fenton stared grimly at the horizon, as though unable to look at the Cortlands. Arthur's voice broke the silence, rough and disbelieving. "Harriet, my own wife." She met his eyes then, her expression cool but her voice trembling. "Yes, Arthur, I am guilty. Do you not see? Day after day you crushed me with your order, your rules, your ledgers. You demanded obedience, not companionship. I had no life of my own. I was a prisoner in your house, and I longed for freedom." Her tone hardened. "The poison was for you, Arthur, not for Sir Lionel. He was an accident of fate. Had you kept the card as you always did, it would be you lying in the earth. And perhaps I would have smiled at last." Arthur staggered back, his face gray with shock. "I gave you everything, status, comfort, respectability. And in return," Harriet replied coldly, "you gave me nothing of the heart. No kindness, no warmth. You cannot imagine what it is to live under your shadow. I chose my escape. It was clumsy. Yes, but it was mine." Her calmness unnerved them all. Even Major Fenton, who had seen much in war, muttered a prayer. Price stepped forward. "You speak of escape, Mrs. Cortland, but you are wrong. You did not escape. You murdered, and you murdered the wrong man. Sir Lionel Dayne lies dead because of you." Harriet's chin lifted. "I accept that. Fate turned its hand, but I do not repent." The inspector gave a quiet signal. 2 constables stepped forward. Harriet offered no resistance as they took her parasol and placed her between them. She walked with measured dignity, her head high, as though she were the hostess of a garden party rather than a prisoner. Arthur Cortland stood rooted, his face a mask of grief and fury. The silence between husband and wife was heavier than any spoken words. As the small procession moved off, Price lingered a moment longer. He looked down at the patch of bruised grass where Sir Lionel had fallen, the dew already drying in the sunlight. A poisoned pencil, a trivial habit, a wife's quiet desperation. Such small things. Yet they had destroyed 3 lives and shaken the peace of Brockenhurst. Murder, Price murmured to himself, begins in whispers, in little gestures, and ends where no one intends. Chapter 70, The Last Hole. The library of Brockenhurst Royal was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. The suspects, no longer suspects now, but wary witnesses, sat gathered in their familiar seats. The long table gleamed under lamplight, its surface scattered with the small, ordinary objects that had carried death: the flask, the sandwiches, the box of sharpened pencils, and at the very center, the sealed envelope holding the poisoned stub. Inspector Price stood at the hearth, his figure dark against the fire's glow. His expression was grave but calm, the manner of a man who had brought order out of chaos, though at a heavy cost. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the truth is no longer in doubt. Sir Lionel Dayne was poisoned. The weapon was a pencil, sharp, harmless to the eye, but deadly at its point. The crystals of cyanide upon its lead were meant not for Sir Lionel, but for Arthur Courtland. Sir Lionel died because of a small accident of chance." A murmur stirred among them. Major Fenton shook his head slowly. Gideon Hart leaned back in his chair, lips pursed. Miss Phoebe Littleton dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from shock or from the drama of it all, Price could not say. Price continued steadily. "Mr. Courtland, you have a habit of licking the pencil before marking scores. That habit was known to your wife. She purchased cyanide, signing the chemist's book H. Courtland. She applied it to the point of a pencil, counting on your habit to do the rest. She could not have foreseen that Mr. Pritchard, in a moment of thoughtlessness, would suggest Sir Lionel keep the scorecard instead. That one decision sealed Sir Lionel's fate." Arthur Courtland sat rigid in his chair, his face pale and hollow, his large hands clasped tightly before him. He did not speak. Price turned his gaze upon the others. There were, of course, false trails. The Foreign Office letter told us Sir Lionel carried drafts of a trade agreement. Their absence suggested theft, and suspicion might easily have fallen upon Mr. Hart here. He had dined with Sir Lionel the evening before, and his eagerness to leave when poison was mentioned made him appear guilty. But the method of death was too intimate, too bound to habit, to be the work of a spy. Espionage deals in stolen papers and paid informants, not sharpened pencils. Hart gave a rueful smile. "Inspector, you nearly had me convinced I was a spy myself." Price allowed himself a faint nod before turning to Pritchard. "A's for you, Mr. Pritchard. Your suggestion that Sir Lionel keep the card might have incriminated you, but your nervousness was not guilt, only the fear of a young man who realizes too late the weight of his actions. You did not poison the pencil, but you unwittingly placed it in Sir Lionel's hand." Pritchard swallowed hard, his face white, but he nodded. "Miss Littleton," Price added, "your role was merely to sharpen the pencils. You had no hand in this crime, yet even you, with your love of neatness, became part of the chain that led to death. It is a reminder that murder often hides in the ordinary." Miss Littleton lowered her head, relieved but shaken. Price let the silence hang for a moment, then spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Harriet Courtland has confessed. She meant to kill her husband. She killed Sir Lionel instead. She will answer for it before the law. It is a tragedy born not of politics nor foreign intrigue, but of domestic discontent. A wife's bitterness, a husband's habit, and the blind hand of chance." He stepped away from the table, his eyes resting briefly on each of them. "Remember this, all of you. Murder is rarely born in great conspiracies. More often it begins in quiet rooms, in resentments left to fester, in habits so small we do not even notice them. Sir Lionel Dayne died because of a pencil point, a gesture, and a woman's despair. That is all, and yet it is enough." The group remained silent. Major Fenton stared grimly at the fire. Pritchard sat with his head in his hands. Hart lit a cigarette, the flame of his match briefly illuminating his thoughtful expression. Courtland remained motionless, as though carved from stone. At last, Price gathered the evidence, sealing the envelope once more. He replaced the chemist's note, the flask, and the sandwiches in his case. The small objects clinked faintly as the case closed, and with that sound, the spell seemed to break. "Good night, gentlemen. Miss Littleton," he said, bowing slightly. "This matter is ended." He left them in the lamplight, the hush of the library closing behind him. Outside, the course lay quiet, the mist rising once more from the hollows. The seventh flag stirred faintly in the breeze, innocent as ever, yet to Inspector Price, it would forever be marked. The place where chance and habit had conspired to turn one woman's desperate plan into a national tragedy. Epilogue: The quiet fairway. A week later, Inspector Price returned briefly to Brockenhurst Royal. The club had resumed its routines. The clink of golf balls on the practice green, the murmur of polite conversation on the terrace, the waiters carrying tea and sandwiches as though nothing had ever happened. Yet beneath the surface, the shadow of Sir Lionel's death lingered. Members still glanced at the seventh hole with unease. Caddies spoke of the spot in whispers, as if the grass itself remembered. Harriet Cortland had been taken away in a black motor car, her head held high, and the club was left to explain her absence in delicate half-truths. Arthur Cortland had not returned since that day. Price stood alone on the seventh fairway, his shoes sinking slightly into the damp turf. The flag stirred in the summer breeze, bright against the sky. It looked so innocent, so ordinary. Yet he knew the place was stained with the memory of a diplomat who should never have died. He bent and picked up a pencil stub lying near the tee, carelessly dropped by some player. He turned it between his fingers, reflecting on how such a trivial object had once carried death. A pencil, a habit, a marriage sored by bitterness. No grand conspiracy, no foreign intrigue, merely the quiet malice of domestic life. As he dropped the stub back into the grass, he murmured to himself, "It is never the grand gestures that bring ruin, but the smallest ones. Murder does not begin with daggers in the dark. It begins with a thought unspoken, a habit unnoticed, a heart left cold." Then he turned, his coat stirring in the breeze, and walked back toward the waiting motor car. The game at Brockenhurst Royal had resumed, but the seventh fairway would never be quite the same again.